Chapter 5. A Note on Emigration. Section 1. The Need of a New Spirit. Before closing these notes with some words on the colonial aspect of democratic distribution, it will be well to make some acknowledgments of the recent suggestion of so distinguished a man as Mr. John Galsworthy. Mr. Galsworthy is a man for whom I have the very warmest regard. For a human being who really tries to be fair is something very like a monster and miracle in the long history of this merry race of ours. Sometimes, indeed, I get a little exasperated at being so persistently excused. I can imagine few things more annoying to a free-born and properly constituted Christian than the thought that if he did choose to wait for Mr. Galsworthy behind a wall, knock him down with a brick, jump on him with heavy boots, and so on, Mr. Galsworthy would still faintly gasp that it was only the fault of the system. That the system made bricks, and the system heaved bricks, and the system went about wearing heavy boots, and so on. As a human being, I should feel a longing for a little human justice, after all that inhuman mercy. But these feelings do not interfere with the other feelings I have, of something like enthusiasms for something that can only be called beautiful in the fair-mindedness of a study like The White Monkey. It is when this attitude of detachment is applied not to the judgment of individuals but of men in bulk, that the detachment begins to savour of something unnatural. And in Mr. Galsworthy's less political pronouncement, the detachment amounts to despair. At any rate, it amounts to despair about this earth, this England, about which I am certainly not going to despair yet. But I think it might be well if I took this opportunity of stating what I, for one, at least feel about the different claims here involved. It may be debated whether it's a good or a bad thing for England that England has an empire. It may be debated, at least as a matter of true definition, whether England has an empire at all. But upon one point all Englishmen ought to stand firm, as a matter of history, of philosophy, and of logic. And that is that it has been, and is, a question of our owning an empire, and not of an empire owning us. There is a sense in being separated from Americans on the principles of George Washington, and a sense in being attached to Americans on the principles of George III. But there is no sense in being outvoted and swamped by Americans in the name of the Anglo-Saxon race. The colonies were by origin English. They owe us that much, if it be only the trivial circumstance so little valued by modern thought that without their maker they could never have existed at all. If they choose to remain English, we thank them very sincerely for the compliment. If they choose not to remain English, but to turn into something else, we think they are within their rights. But anyhow, England shall remain English. They shall not first turn themselves into something else, and then turn us into themselves. It may have been wrong to be an empire, but it does not rob us of our right to be a nation. But there is another sense in which those of our school would use the motto of England first. It is in the sense that our first step should be to discover how far the best ethical and economic system can be fitted into England before we treat it as an export and cart it away to the ends of the earth. The scientific or commercial character, who is sure he has found an explosive that will blow up the solar system or a bullet that will kill the man in the moon, always makes a great parade of saying that he offers it first to his own country and only afterwards to a foreign country. Personally, I cannot conceive how a man can bring himself in any case to offer such a thing to a foreign country, but then I am not a great scientific and commercial genius. Anyhow, such as our little notion of normal ownership is, we certainly do not propose to offer it to any foreign country, or even to any colony, before we offer it to our own country. And we do think it highly urgent and practical to find out first how much of it can really be carried out in our own country. Nobody supposes that the whole English population could live on the English land. But everybody ought to realize that immeasurably more people could live on it than do live on it, and that if such a policy did establish such a peasantry, there would be a recognizable narrowing of the margin of men left over for the town and the colonies. But we would suggest that these ought really to be left over and dealt with as seems most desirable, after the main experiment has been made where it matters most. And what most of us would complain of in the emigrationists of the ordinary sort is that they seem to think first of the colony, and then of what must be left behind in the country, instead of thinking first of the country, and then of what must overflow into the colony. People talk about an optimist being in a hurry, but it seems to me that a pessimist like Mr. Galsworthy is very much in a hurry. He has not tried the obvious reform on England, and finding it fail, gone into exile to try it elsewhere. He is trying the obvious reform everywhere except where it is most obvious. And in this, I think he has a subconscious affinity to people much less reasonable and respectable than himself. The pessimists have a curious way of urging us to counsels of despair is the only solution of a problem they have not troubled to solve. They declare solemnly that some unnatural thing would become necessary if certain conditions existed, and then somehow assume from that they exist. They never think of attempting to prove that they exist before they prove what follows from their existence. This is exactly the sort of plunging and premature pessimism, for instance, that people exhibit about birth control. Their desire is toward destruction. Their hope is for despair. They eagerly anticipate the darkest and most doubtful predictions. They run with eager feet before and beyond the lingering and inconveniently slow statistics. Like the hart pants for the water brooks, they thirst to drink of Styx and Lethe before their hour. Even the facts they show fall far short of the faith that they see shining beyond them. For faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If I do not compare the critic in question with the doctors of this dismal perversion, still less do I compare him with those whose motives are merely self-protective and plutocratic. But it must also be said that many rush to the expedient of immigration, just as many rush to the expedient of birth control, for the perfectly simple reason that it is the easiest way in which the capitalists can escape from their own blunder of capitalism. They lured men into the town with the promise of greater pleasures. They ruined him there, and left him there with only one pleasure. They found the increase it produced at first convenient for labour, and then inconvenient for supply, and now they are ready to round off their experiment in a highly appropriate manner by telling them that they must have no families, or that their families must go to the modern equivalent of Botany Bay. It is not in that spirit that we envisage an element of colonization, and so long as it is treated in that spirit, we refuse to consider it. I put first the statement that real colonial settlement must not only be stable, but sacred. I say the new home must not only be a home, but a shrine. And that is why I say it must be first established in England, in the home of our fathers, in the shrine of our saints, to be a light and an ensign to our children. I have explained that I cannot content myself with leaving my own nationality out of my own normal ideal, or leaving England as the mere tool-house or coal-cellar of other countries like Canada or Australia, or for that matter Argentina. I should like England also to have a much more rural type of redistribution, nor do I think it impossible. But when this is allowed for, nobody in his 5 wits would dream of denying that there is a real scope and even necessity for immigration and colonial settlement. Only, when we come to that, I have to draw a line rather sharply and explain something else, which is by no means inconsistent with my love of England, but I fear is not so likely to make me loved by Englishmen. I do not believe, as the newspapers and national histories always tell me to believe, that we have the secret of this sort of successful colonization, and need nothing else to achieve this sort of democratic social construction. I ask for nothing better than that a man should be English in England, but I think he will have to be something more than English, or at any rate something more than British, if he is to create a solid social equality outside England. For something is needed for that solid social creation which our colonial tradition has not given. My reasons for holding this highly unpopular opinion I will attempt to suggest, but the fact that they are rather difficult to suggest is itself an evidence of their unfamiliarity and of that narrowness which is neither national nor international, but only imperial. I should very much like to be present at a conversation between Mr. Sacklettwaller and Dean Ing. I have a great deal of respect for the real sincerity of the Dean of St. Paul's, but his subconscious prejudices are of a strange sort. I cannot help having a feeling that he might have a certain sympathy with the socialist, so long as he was not a Christian socialist. I do not indeed pretend to any respect for the ordinary sort of broad-mindedness which is ready to embrace a Buddhist but draws the line at a Bolshevist. I think its significance is very simple. It means welcoming alien religions when they make us feel comfortable, and persecuting them when they make us feel uncomfortable. But the particular reason I have at the moment for entertaining this association of ideas is one that concerns a larger matter. It concerns, indeed, what is commonly called the British Empire, which we were once taught to reverence largely because it was large. And one of my complaints against that common and rather vulgar sort of imperialism is that it does not really secure even the advantages of largeness. As I have said, I am a nationalist. England is good enough for me. I would defend England against the whole European continent. With even greater joy would I defend England against the whole British Empire. With a romantic rapture would I defend England against Mr. Ramsay MacDonald when he had become King of Scotland, lighting again the watchfires of Newark and Carlisle, and sounding the old tocsins of the border. With equal energy would I defend England against Mr. Tim Healy as King of Ireland, if ever the gross and growing prosperity of that helpless and decaying Celtic stock became positively offensive. With the greatest ecstasy of all would I defend England against Mr. Lloyd George as King of Wales. It will be seen, therefore, that there is nothing broad-minded about my patriotism. Most modern nationality is not narrow enough for me. But, putting aside my own local affections, and looking at the matter in what is called a larger way, I note once more that our imperialism does not get any of the good that could be got out of being large. And I was reminded of Dean Ing because he suggested some time ago that the Irish and the French Canadians were increasing in numbers, not because they held the Catholic view of the family, but because they were a backward and apparently almost barbaric stock, which naturally, I suppose he meant, increased with the blind luxuriance of a jungle. I have already remarked on the amusing trick of having it both ways, which is illustrated in this remark. So long as savages are dying out, we say they are dying out because they are savages. When they are inconveniently increasing, we say they are increasing because they are savages. And from this, it is but a simple logical step to say that the countrymen of Sir Wilfrid Laurier or Senator Yates are savages because they are increasing. But what strikes me most about the situation is this, that this spirit will always miss what is really to be learnt by covering any large and varied area. If French Canada is really part of the British Empire, it would seem that the Empire might at least have served as a sort of interpreter between the British and the French. The imperial statesman, if he had really been a statesman, ought to have been able to say, "It is always difficult to understand another nation or another religion, but I am more fortunately placed than most people. I know a little more than can be known by self-contained and isolated states like Sweden or Spain. I have more sympathy with the Catholic faith or the French blood because I have French Catholics in my own empire." Now it seems to me that the imperial statesman never has said this, never has even been able to say it, never has even tried or pretended to be able to say it. He has been far narrower than a nationalist like myself, engaged in desperately defending Offa's Dyke against a horde of Welsh politicians. I doubt if there was ever a politician who knew a word more of the French language, let alone a word more of the Latin Mass, because he had to govern a whole population that drew its traditions from Rome and Gaul. I will suggest in a moment how this enormous international narrowness affects the question of a peasantry and the extension of the natural ownership of land. But for the moment it is important to make the point clear about the nature of that narrowness. And that is why some light might be thrown on it in that tender, that intimate, that heart-to-heart talk between Mr. Sacklettwaller and the Dean of St. Paul's. Mr. Sacklettwaller is a sort of parody or extreme and extravagant exhibition of the point that we really know nothing at all about the moral and philosophical elements that make up the empire. It is quite obvious, of course, that he does not represent Battersea. But have we any way of knowing to what extent he represents India? It seems to me not impossible that the more impersonal and indefinite doctrines of Asia do form a soil for Bolshevism. Most of the Eastern philosophy differs from the Western theology in refusing to draw the line anywhere, and it would be a highly probable perversion of that instinct to refuse to draw the line between meum and tuum. I do not think the Indian gentleman is any judge of whether we in the West want to have a hedge round our fields, or a wall round our gardens. And as I happen to hold that the very highest human thought and art consists almost entirely in drawing the line somewhere, though not drawing it anywhere, I am completely confident that in this the Western tendency is right, and the Eastern tendency is wrong. But, in any case, it seems to me that a rather sharp lesson to us is indicated in these two parallel cases of the Indian who grows into a Bolshevist in our dominions without our being able to influence his growth, and the French-Canadian who remains a peasant in our dominions without our getting any sort of advantage out of his stability. I do not profess to know very much about the French-Canadians, but I know enough to know that most of the people who talk at large about the Empire know even less than I do. And the point about them is that they generally do not even try to know any more. The very vague picture that they always call up, of colonists doing wonders in all corners of the world, never does, in fact, include the sort of things that French-Canadians can do, or might possibly show other people how to do. There is about all this fashionable fancy of colonization a very dangerous sort of hypocrisy. People tried to use the overseas dominion as El Dorado while still using it as Botany Bay. They sent away people that they wanted to get rid of, and then added insult to injury by representing that the ends of the earth would be delighted to have them. And they called up a sort of fancy portrait of a person whose virtues and even vices were entirely suitable for founding an empire, though apparently quite unsuitable for founding a family. The very language they used was misleading. They talked of such people as settlers, but the very last thing they ever expected them to do was to settle. They expected of them a sort of indistinct individualistic breaking of new ground, for which the world is less and less really concerned today. They sent an inconvenient nephew to hunt wild bison in the streets of Toronto, just as they had sent any number of irrepressible Irish exiles to war with wild redskins in the streets of New York. They incessantly repeated that what the world wants is pioneers, and had never even heard that what the world wants is peasants. There was a certain amount of sincere and natural sentiment about the wandering exile inherent in our traditions. There was really no pretense that he was engaged in founding his own traditions. All the ideas that go with a secure social standing were absent from the very discussion. No one thought of the continuity, the customs, the religion, or the folklore of the future colonist. Above all, nobody ever conceived him as having any strong sense of private property. There was in the vague idea of his gaining something for the empire always, if anything, the idea of his gaining what belonged to somebody else. I am not now discussing how wrong it was, or whether it could in some cases be right. I am pointing out that nobody ever entertained the notion of the other sort of right, the special right of every man to his own. I doubt whether a word could be quoted emphasizing it even from the healthiest adventure story, or the jolliest jingo song. I quite appreciate all there is in such songs or stories that is really healthy or jolly. I am only pointing out that we have badly neglected something, and are now suffering from the neglect. And the worst aspect of the neglect was that we learnt nothing whatever from the peoples that were actually inside the empire which we wished to glorify, nothing whatever from the Irish, nothing whatever from the French-Canadians, nothing whatever even from the poor Hindus. We have now reached a crisis in which we particularly require these neglected talents, and we do not even know how to set about learning them. And the explanation of this blunder, as of most blunders, is the weakness which is called pride. In other words, it is in the tone taken by people like the Dean of St. Paul's. Now, there will be needed a large element of immigration in the solution of recreating a peasantry in the modern world. I shall have more to say about the elements of that idea in the next section. But I believe that any scheme of the sort will have to be based on a totally different, and indeed diametrically opposite spirit and principle to that which is commonly applied to immigration in England today, I think we need a new sort of inspiration, a new sort of appeal, a new sort of ordinary language even, before that solution will even help to solve anything. What we need is the ideal of property, not merely progress, especially progress over other people's property. Utopia needs more frontiers, not less. And it is because we were weak in the ethics of property on the edges of empire that our own society will not defend property as men defend a right. The Bolshevist is the sequel and punishment of the buccaneer.